We represent a group of women first responders from Asia, Africa, and the Pacific who have provided leadership in response to recent emergencies in our countries. This has included relief distribution, psychosocial support, shelter and livelihood recovery in response to Typhoon Haiyan, representing women on local disaster management committees and mobilizing women to respond to drought in Kenya, training young people, religious and community leaders to raise awareness and respond to Ebola, and innovating through establishing hand-washing stations in Liberia, using community media to roll out the Women's Weather Watch campaign in Fiji that documents women's experiences during disasters, and mobilizing women in the response to Cyclone Pam in Vanuatu around community-based protection and other priorities for rural women.
We have faced many barriers in our efforts to provide leadership in humanitarian action. Women are often limited by a lack of information or access to education, which impacts on the ability to participate. In all our countries, despite global commitments to gender equality, male-dominated leadership continues to mark the response to humanitarian emergencies, giving limited recognition to the efforts of women in times of crisis and limiting the space for women's access to decision-making, including on priorities for the response.
The lack of access to basic health care services in many communities also impacts on women who are forced to carry the burden of unpaid care in response service gaps. From many of our countries, we see poor local governance around ensuring protection of women's rights in times of crisis. We are concerned by the continuous exploitation of women and young girls in internally displaced camps and the lack of accountability of humanitarian workers.
We are concerned by the behavior of humanitarian actors that ignore local organizations and poach our staff with high salaries in times of crisis, as well as the failure to treat local actors as experts in our own rights. We also see many opportunities to further strengthen our leadership as first responders in times of crisis and build an intergenerational approach to enhance and sustain leadership. While actors do not have a fair share of the funding in humanitarian crisis, women's rights and women's-led organizations exist with minimal resources and often have limited funds to sustain their advocacy work and operations.
This includes limited resources to document their efforts to respond, even though they are better placed to work in affected communities. Supporting women's local organizing effort is an important step in supporting women's leadership so that women can establish locally led responses that especially promote and protect women's rights at all stages of the response.
Having female role models in communities also provides the impetus for other women to get involved and see the potential to be engaged in humanitarian action. Women also provide vital knowledge on local culture and beliefs that can support humanitarian actors to deliver more effective and sustainable responses. Our leadership in relief distribution will also ensure sexual exploitation and abuse in distribution chains is eradicated.
We believe women's leadership can be enhanced by investing in the documentation and communication of women's experience in times of crisis to highlight gaps in the humanitarian response to feed international authorities and humanitarian coordination system. Ensuring women's access to information in times of crisis is also important and is made accessible through women's network, women's spaces, and media platforms.
There is also an opportunity to build upon existing mechanisms for women's rights, such as the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, including General Recommendation 34, United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 and 2242, and the Beijing Platform for Action, to better link these with humanitarian response. At the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul, we are calling on the international humanitarian community, including governments, INGOs and UN agencies, to consider the following recommendations as they make commitments to catalyze action to achieve gender equality.